Hello and welcome to this video on Othello. It's an analysis of Act 3, Scene 4, and as you're watching it, I'd like you to use a Cornell note-taking sheet to help you to recall the information. There are 3 steps to this and you can see it on the screen, so pause the video and you can draw out your sheet. You should also have a copy of the play in front of you, and it might be helpful if you read through the scene as well and refer to your copy of the play as I'm talking in the video. Okay, so where are we in the play at the moment? Well, we've had the exposition where Shakespeare has established Othello's nobility against a background of xenophobia. So we've seen Iago and Rodrigo waken Brabantio, Iago manipulating Rodrigo, and then presenting an honest face to Othello. Now, the Duke of Venice has agreed to the marriage, and Desdemona and Othello, as well as Iago and Rodrigo and Cassio, have gone off on the ships into the battle against Turkey. During the rising action, so Act 2 of the play, Shakespeare starts to reveal how one's insecurities can be exploited, and this destabilises the precarious balance of love, marriage and the social order. So at the start of this scene, we realise that this is not a public political play, but it's actually more private, because a storm has destroyed the Turkish fleet, meaning that there's not going to be any of the wars of violence in the same sense as we see it in some of Shakespeare's other tragedies. And Othello arrives on Cyprus, meeting Desdemona again, and is completely overwhelmed by love for her. After that, there's a feast to celebrate the marriage and also the victory against Cyprus. In this feast, Cassio becomes drunk. Well, he's made drunk by Iago and Rodrigo. He fights and is then demoted by Othello. Cassio then speaks to Desdemona alone, and Desdemona is going to intercede for Cassio. We're about here in the play, so at the climax of it now, and at this point deception and duplicity dominate, whilst the destructive power of jealousy becomes clear. So in the scene we're going to look at today, Othello and Desdemona argue about the handkerchief and about Cassio. Unbeknownst to them, Cassio has found the handkerchief and gives it to the courtesan Bianca. It's really important to note which pieces of information different characters have at this point in the play. So Emilia knows that she's picked up the handkerchief and given it to Iago, but she doesn't know what's happened to it after that. She doesn't know what Iago's plan is, so she doesn't say very much about that in this scene, possibly because she's waiting to find out what's actually happened before she commits herself. Desdemona has no idea where the handkerchief is. Cassio doesn't know who the handkerchief has come from. So there are lots of pieces of the jigsaw that Iago can see the whole picture, but the other individual characters can't. After this scene, of course, we have the falling action and the denouement, which we'll look at later on in the course. So what actually happens in Act 3, Scene 4? Well, firstly, Desdemona asks the clown where Cassio lives. Now, this question may seem very innocuous, however, it's crucial to understanding Desdemona's character. Shakespeare is giving us the clear evidence, the ocular proof, that Desdemona is innocent of all of the accusations which are going to be levelled at her by Othello. And why is this? It's just a question about Cassio's lodgings. Well, Desdemona has no reason to deceive the clown, and therefore this question emphasises her innocence at this point in the play. She hasn't visited Cassio's bedchamber. She therefore couldn't have left the handkerchief there, and importantly, she couldn't have had an affair with him in his bedchamber because she simply doesn't know where it is. The clown then leaves to find Cassio, and Desdemona asks Emilia where the handkerchief could possibly be. And as I said on the previous slide, Emilia doesn't respond. She doesn't tell Desdemona the truth about the handkerchief. Desdemona then insists that Othello cannot possibly be jealous, but Emilia thinks otherwise, and she's trying to suggest to Desdemona that actually Othello is jealous. These questions from Emilia could perhaps be trying to steer Desdemona in a different direction and into a different course of action. Othello then enters, and he explains in an aside to the audience that he's pretending to be calm. He takes Desdemona's hand, commenting that it is moist, and this is where he starts to question Desdemona obliquely. Desdemona doesn't realise that she's being interrogated, but from this point onwards through the rest of the play, the conversations that Othello have with Desdemona are an attempt to unearth evidence of her sexual immorality, of her infidelity with Cassio. So Desdemona doesn't understand the comments about her hand, but for Othello, having a moist hand is evidence of this infidelity. Then Desdemona tells Othello that she has sent for Cassio so that the two men can talk. Now, the moist hand and the sending for Cassio aren't connected in Desdemona's head. She doesn't see any link between them. But for Othello, there is a clear link that as soon as he's talking about her hand, she links that to Cassio and so on, and he takes this as evidence that she's having an affair. At the mention of Cassio, Othello then asks to borrow Desdemona's handkerchief, and she doesn't have it with her. And this is another example of where Othello's making connections between things, but Desdemona doesn't see the connection. So Othello then recounts the history of the handkerchief, and it's a very loaded description, and it's unclear to the audience whether it's actually true or whether Othello is creating this for the purpose of trying to ensnare Desdemona and trying to make a point to her. So Othello says that an Egyptian gave the handkerchief to his mother. So the handkerchief has some very exotic connotations, and therefore we see that maybe Shakespeare is crafting Othello into a more stereotypical character for the time. The handkerchief was supposed to help her subdue my father entirely to her love. So by this, Othello means that the handkerchief would help his mother to retain the love of her husband. If she lost the handkerchief, then her husband would become unfaithful. She gave the handkerchief to Othello on her deathbed and asked him to give it to his wife. So here Othello is giving the handkerchief huge emotional connotations that Desdemona was completely unaware of. So he's really transforming the situation, transforming the handkerchief from, quite a nice love token to a family heirloom. Othello then concludes the tale by saying if Desdemona lost it, then perdition would be the result. And we've seen this word perdition earlier in the play. Othello has said that he will go to perdition if he doesn't love Desdemona. Perdition can mean hell. So he then informs her that the handkerchief has magic qualities as it was created by a sibyl or a prophetess. So Desdemona is upset, but insists she has not lost the handkerchief. And here is the first example of Desdemona being deceptive and lying in the play. She knows she's lost it, but at this point in the play she wants to cover that up until she's worked out what's going on. She says she will get the handkerchief, but only once Othello has met with Cassio. So again, in Othello's mind, this is making a connection between the symbol of her infidelity, the handkerchief, and her frequently mentioning Cassio's name, frequently mentioning the name of the person who Othello presumes that she is in love with. And so after that, the conversation oscillates between Othello's demand to see the handkerchief and Desdemona's pleas for Cassio to be pardoned. Othello exits in a state of absolute fury, and then Emilia asks again if he is jealous. Desdemona says he's never acted like this before, and she is very disconcerted at this conversation. After that, there's a different section of the scene. Cassio and Iago enter. Desdemona tells Cassio that her intercession has failed, and she reasons that news from Venice has upset Othello. Desdemona and Emilia leave in search of Othello, and then Bianca enters. So Cassio tells Bianca that he was on his way to visit her, to which Bianca responds that he's been away for far too long. Cassio then gives Bianca the handkerchief, saying that he find it in his bedchamber, and he asks her to copy the pattern. He then asks Bianca to leave so that Othello will not see him with a woman. And of course, this would be clear to the audience from Bianca's costume that she is a courtesan, she's a prostitute, and therefore it's not just that Othello would see Cassio with another woman, but also that he would see Cassio with someone who's maybe connected with immorality. So zooming in on the characters then, firstly looking at Desdemona. In this scene, she is becoming the powerless, tragic victim that we're going to see in Act 5. So initially she's bewildered in this scene. She doesn't have the knowledge necessary to escape Iago's net. And we see this in her first line, when she asks the clown, "Do you know where Lieutenant Cassio lives?" And then later in the scene, she hasn't heard the history of the handkerchief before, and she asks Othello, "Is it possible? Is this story true that you're telling me?" So she's bewildered by all the different pieces of information that are being thrown at her, and she doesn't know how to put them together. And this really starts to develop a great level of pathos for a character, that earlier in the play we've admired for her determination, for her outspokenness, for being unstereotypically dominant in the play, whereas here she seems to become powerless, she seems to become more of a victim in the play. She's also betrayed. She's deceived by those closest to her. So Emilia knows of the location of the handkerchief, but doesn't mention it. And at this point, the audience sees Desdemona as completely isolated from her husband, but also from the person who's her servant, but also supposed to be her closest friend in Cyprus. And remember that Desdemona has been sequestered at home. She's never travelled before, she's never been in much society before, and now she's on the edges of civilization in Cyprus, and is being deceived by the people who are supposed to look after her. She also comes across as being very genuine in this scene, and so to the audience it's clear that Desdemona raises the topic of Cassio's dismissal because she wants to help him, whereas to Othello this is a sign of her guilt. She's also continually loyal to Othello. When Emilia says that Othello's jealous, Desdemona responds, he's indicted falsely, he's been falsely accused, he's not jealous, he's just busy with work and worried about kind of manly business. She comes across as naive as well in this scene, so it's obvious to us that Desdemona's marriage is built on precarious foundations. It's not just that they don't know much about each other as people, but also Desdemona doesn't understand Othello's character at all. She loves him because he's a hero, which is pointed out in Act 1, but she doesn't understand the darker sides to his character, and her lack of understanding of Othello's anger is juxtaposed against Emilia's observant question, is not this man jealous? Emilia very quietly watches what's going on between the other characters and comes to the right conclusion, whereas in contrast to that, the person who's supposed to know Othello the best, his wife, doesn't understand what's happening, and that reveals her lack of understanding not only of her husband but also of the world and of courtship and of romance. Finally, she's increasingly subordinate in this scene, and as the state of their marriage worsens, Desdemona becomes subservient not just to Othello but to the other men in the play. So whereas in Act 1, Scene 3, she insisted on travelling to war with Othello, which was a very unstereotypical act, it was very brave, and it showed her great loyalty to him, in Act 3, Scene 4, she makes vague comments about something sure of state. So we've seen her in the Sagittary, where the men are discussing the plans for the war in Act 1, and she takes part in that conversation. And then in Act 3, she talks something to do with the state. She's very unclear about what's actually happening, and that's a real transformation in Desdemona's character. Emilia in this scene then is very interesting as well. She's becoming more prominent as we progress through the play, and it seems that as Desdemona loses understanding and control in the play, Emilia actually develops her understanding and her oversight of what's happening. At this stage, she's on the brink between being Iago's pawn and being her own person. So initially she's loyal but still subservient to Iago. Despite witnessing the argument about the handkerchief, she doesn't mention that she's picked it up, so she's possibly being loyal to Iago. She also appears to play along with Iago, so she says to Desdemona that, she says to Iago, Othello went hence but now, and certainly in strange unquietness. So it seems that she's reporting back to Iago, telling him about the progress of his plan, even though she's not quite clear what that plan is. On the other hand, it could be argued that she's actually being loyal to Desdemona in this scene. She seems quite genuine in her reassurance of Desdemona, and she says to her, pray heaven it be, state matters as you think. As in, she means, let's hope that Othello is just upset about political matters rather than being jealous. And as early as line 28, Emilia asks, is he not jealous? And this could be interpreted as a covert warning to Desdemona to act shrewdly. Emilia is trying to guide Desdemona into a particular line of action rather than doing what she does, which is ignorantly revealing her misunderstanding of what's happening. It could also be argued that the reason that Emilia doesn't mention the handkerchief is that she wants to find out what's happened to it and therefore use that knowledge to help Desdemona, but there's no clear evidence of that in the play. Emilia is also very observant and knowledgeable about life in general, so her questions about jealousy may stem from Iago's treatment of her. She may be aware of her husband's jealousy. We know as the audience that Iago suspects Othello of having done my office, and that he's offended at Cassio's promotion, and it stands to reason that Emilia's questions to Desdemona come from her own experience of her own marriage with Iago. She also recognises that jealousy is a monster begot upon itself, as in it's a monster in the mind, something that you lack control over, something that feeds itself, it's begot upon itself, it kind of gives itself birth, and it grows and grows out of control. And that line echoes Iago's comment about the green-eyed monster earlier. So she's clearly very close to her husband in some senses, and has a deeper understanding than Desdemona of the way relationships work and the way jealousy can play upon one's psychological state. She also seems to be becoming uneasy, although she lacks knowledge of Iago's plan. As I said earlier, she's watching and she's trying to work out what's going on. And in this scene, it's interesting that she enters and exits with Desdemona rather than at Iago's command. So in the previous scene, Iago sent her in to talk to Cassio, whereas now that relationship seems to be diminishing slightly, and she seems to be closer to Desdemona at this point in the play. So it's really a turning point for Emilia's character, I suppose. Othello's character then, so he's becoming the enraged tragic hero. He's very accusatory of Desdemona, and he's searching for ocular proof of her infidelity. He believes her moist hand is evidence of this, and he accuses her, but he's not prepared to listen to what she says. He then accuses her again regarding the missing handkerchief. He says that's a fault. And this is a huge transformation from Act 2, Scene 1, where he said that Desdemona is his soul's joy. In this scene, he also starts to manipulate Desdemona, so we ask ourselves if the history of the handkerchief is true. Even if it is true, he tells it in such a way as to reveal his opinion about infidelity and to manipulate Desdemona's emotions to make her feel even more guilty about losing the handkerchief. The mention of the magic in the web of the handkerchief is interesting. It recalls Othello's tales of exotic travels in Act 1, Scene 3, but it also contradicts his insistence that there was no witchcraft in his romance with Desdemona. So as an audience, we may be starting to question his apparent truthfulness in Act 1 and his insistence on the way the relationship was conducted. And is that actually true, or is there something else going on in Othello's relationship with her? Othello also becomes increasingly irrational at this point in the play. In contrast to his eloquence in Act 1, here his speech is breaking down, so he exclaims, "Ha, wherefore?" and "zounds," which are words that he wouldn't have used in front of female characters. In fact, he wouldn't have sworn at all previously. And he's becoming more similar to Iago in his speech. He also insistently repeats the phrase "the handkerchief," which reveals his increasing obsession with it as a symbol of honesty, or as a symbol of a lack of honesty. The next character I want to look at here is Bianca, who we haven't seen before in the play. She's a powerless courtesan, or a prostitute, who lives on Cyprus and is engaged in some kind of relationship with Cassio. Now, it doesn't seem to be the usual relationship between a prostitute and client, because Bianca seems to feel very deeply for Cassio. And this is where the double time of the play comes in as well. Bianca insists that Cassio hasn't been to see her for at least a week, whereas if we follow one time scheme of the play, they've only landed in Cyprus a couple of days ago. However, if we follow Bianca's time scheme of the play, they must have been in Cyprus for quite a long time. And that double time scheme is something that we just have to accept about the play. So Bianca is presented as being infatuated with Cassio, and in this she echoes Desdemona in Act 1. So just as Desdemona did in Act 1, when Bianca first appears on the stage in Act 3, she is completely besotted with her lover. She says her life has been tedious, as Cassio has been away for 7 nights and days, and we really feel like this mirrors that earlier conversation. Bianca also displays jealousy at the sight of the handkerchief, which she believes has been given to Cassio by a new lover. Bianca is presented as being exploited and marginalised as well. Her role in the society at the time would have been very vulnerable. She depends absolutely on the admiration of men like Cassio for her survival. And perhaps there is a financial imperative which prompts her to come and look for Cassio at this point. Perhaps she needs payment from him as well as wanting to see him because she's infatuated with him. And she just accepts Cassio's orders and insults. He says, "Go to, woman." He says, "Leave me for this time." And she just has to go along with this in order to maintain their relationship. And I suppose the function of Bianca in the play is to provide a mirror for Desdemona and Emilia, and to show the audience how a different type of romantic relationship might work. So Bianca's jealousy echoes Othello's, but because of her gender she's supposed to act completely differently. So she cannot accuse her lover of having an affair, she cannot suggest that she would ever leave him or anything like that. But instead she has to kind of playfully question things. Like Desdemona and Emilia, it could also be argued that Bianca is an innocent victim of the patriarchy. So her name Bianca means white, which suggests purity, innocence, vulnerability, and it seems that she's just looking for a way to survive in a male-dominated world. So unlike Desdemona, Bianca knows how to survive. Desdemona doesn't seem to have this skill. She doesn't have the ability to play along with Othello and to find the handkerchief or whatever, or lie convincingly, whereas Bianca knows just to agree with her lover rather than to insist on having her own way. So if we imagine if the roles were reversed, Bianca would have stopped mentioning Cassio a couple of scenes ago when she saw that Othello was becoming jealous of him, whereas Desdemona doesn't have that insight. So Bianca's role in the play is really to highlight some of the issues around gender which are happening in this patriarchal world. Okay, thank you very much for watching this video, and hopefully see you again in the video for Act 4.